Good evening, everyone. I'm Helena Rosenblatt, the chair of the history program here at the Graduate Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. For those of you who are here perhaps for the first time, the Graduate Center is the doctoral granting heart of the City University of New York. And tonight's event is just one of the many conferences, performances, and panel discussions held here each week. So I really urge you to look us up on the internet and come here and visit us often. It's no secret, though, that the Graduate Center is a hub of scholarship. It's here where lots of bold thinking about the major social issues of our time originates, and where we are fully committed to generating conversations across disciplines in our many programs, centers, and institutes. It's also here where just last year a student was named a winner of a Pulitzer Prize, and another a Guggenheim Fellow. Few other institutions boast such a dazzling array of scholars. On that note, I'd like to introduce our two speakers this evening. Chase Robinson was appointed president of the Graduate Center in June 2014, after serving as interim president and provost. We're immensely grateful for his many accomplishments, among which, most recently, securing major funding to enhance faculty support, expanding the Masters of Arts in Liberal Studies program, and launching several initiatives, such as the Advanced Research Collaborative and the Initiative for the Theoretical Sciences and the CUNY Institute for Language Education in Transcultural Contexts. During Chase's tenure as provost, the Graduate Center made major investments in financial aid and hired more than 24 scholar teachers of national and international standing, including the Graduate Center's first Nobel laureate. Under his leadership, the Graduate Center is emerging as a national model in doctoral education, pedagogy, and interdisciplinarity. Chase's other life, of course, is as a leading historian of early Islam. From 1993 until 2008, he was lecturer and professor of Islamic history in the Faculty of Oriental Studies and fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Oxford. Here at the Graduate Center, I'm especially proud to say that he's a distinguished professor in my program, the history program. Professor Robinson is the author of more than 40 articles and the editor or author of 8 books on Islamic history, among which, and I'll only mention 4, Islamic Historiography, Empire and Elites After the Muslim Conquest, and the New Cambridge History of Islam, Volume 1. And of course, his new book, Islamic Civilization in 30 Lives, The First 1,000 Years, which is the topic of this evening's discussion. Joining Chase is Sarah Chayes, a senior associate in Carnegie's Democracy and Rule of Law program, author recently of Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, and an extraordinary person, according to Chase, who knows her well. Sarah is internationally recognized for her innovative thinking on corruption and its implications. Her work explores how severe corruption can help prompt such crises as terrorism, revolutions, and their violent aftermaths, and environmental degradation. Before joining Carnegie, Sarah served as special assistant to the top U.S. military officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. She ended her journalism career in early 2002 after covering the fall of the Taliban for NPR. And she remained in Afghanistan to help rebuild the country. From 1996 to 2001, she was NPR's Paris correspondent. For her work during the Kosovo crisis, she shared the 1999 Foreign Press Club and Sigma Delta Chi Awards. Just this past March, Sarah dazzled us on this stage, describing her experiences in some of the world's most notorious crisis spots. Guiding the conversation that evening was her old friend, Chase Robinson. Tonight, the tables are turned, and I couldn't be more pleased and honored to introduce them both. Thank you, and enjoy the evening.
So Before I even say how honored I am to be here, let me just explain that the reason, the pretext for my introducing this conversation is that we were actually in graduate school together, and I failed where Chase Robinson succeeded. I bailed. And I'd kind of love to start with that a little bit. I mean, you know, you're 20-something, right? And this guy with a briefcase is in your class. And that's really how, I mean, we were all kind of, you know, you can imagine the class of people doing their graduate work on medieval Islam in like 1989, 1990, right? There weren't a lot of us. And then there was Chase, who knew, I mean, he was purposeful, and he had this briefcase, and it was like, did he come out of the womb with this briefcase?
This is like when you go home at Thanksgiving and people tell embarrassing stories, your parents. And before the conversation goes any further, I do want to emphasize that Sarah shares the stage with me by virtue of her deep knowledge of the Middle Eastern erudition, not because she's a specialist in corruption, if I could just make that clear.
How did you light on Islamic history? I mean, this course has been, for the rest of us who tack a lot, it's been so admirable to see someone who seems to know and follow that course. What was it about Islamic history?
It's a good question. It's a question I'm asked frequently enough, and for which I've never come up with a good answer. Biographically or autobiographically, my father was born in China, actually, and my mother, ethnically Ukrainian, and she did all of her speaking with her mother in Ukrainian. So I grew up in a house, as I like to say, filled with third-rate chinoiserie and Ukrainian language being spoken.
Which could tell us something about corruption. We could have a whole other evening.
So I think there's probably something Oedipal that I wanted to do something different from what my family had done. I thought hard. I spent a year, as you know, Sarah, in France when I was in high school, and came back, an arrogant 17-year-old, imagining that he'd mastered French and wanted to do something more difficult. Thought about Japanese, thought about Chinese. Chinese was too close to home, so I began to do Arabic. Little did I know that Arabic would be the task that it turned out to be. One of the many great Orientalists whom Sarah and I had the pleasure of reading was H.A.R. Gibb. And you probably know this anecdote. H.A.R. Gibb, who was an Englishman born in Alexandria, was asked late in his career, after 40 or 50 years of extraordinary scholarship, did you find Arabic difficult? And he said, only the first 10 years. So I got a start, enjoyed Arabic, and as I like to tell my students, there is no period, and I will stand by this, there is no period in recorded human history more interesting than the 7th, 8th, and 9th century, because a religion is invented, a people is invented, the Arabs, an empire is invented, and a language is invented, Arabic. So you may have escaped the clutches of the field.
Sort of.
And I hope I didn't drive you out of it with my briefcase. But I couldn't escape its gravitational pull.
Before we turn to the book, there's just one other aspect of your trajectory that I've just been dying to ask you about, which is Oxford. I mean, I get it, like he kind of looks the part, and he always did look the part, but how does a Yank like go over there and not only teach there for, what was it, 14 years, but actually run part of the place? Like, how was that?
You know, Oxford is a paradoxical place, because on the one hand, there are parts of it that are 700 or 800 years old, and it exudes tradition, custom, and just, in some respects, it's a very conservative place. But on the other hand, it is a remarkably cosmopolitan institution, which goes out of its way, for the most part, to recruit young scholars from wherever in the world they may be. And so I entered a faculty, the term
They
for
came knocking on your door?
a little bit of
ish,
both, a little
yep.
bit of both. But we had in our department Britons, Americans, Germans, Swiss, French, Dutch, an extraordinary place.
Wow.
The bottom line being a commitment to the field and to learning. And so in that sense, whatever expertise I possess and whatever I've happened to have written, I owe it to a large extent to the training that you and I received at Harvard, but then the experience I had there.
Cool. Let me turn to this. It's fantastic. I mean, I cannot tell you guys the joy I had reading this book. And as I said initially, the honor that I feel being able to, sort of introduce with Chayes this incredible piece of scholarship, an enjoyable piece of scholarship to you. One thing that strikes one immediately, this is telling the story of a period of 1,000 years, but through the lives of individuals. So this isn't an analysis. There are analytical pieces to it, but it's a series of narratives, which is a really interesting way. I just came here from Australia, where someone said Aborigines that she had been interviewing told her, we don't teach our children what to think, we teach them how to think, very often by telling them stories, which they're supposed to go back and puzzle over. And so I just wondered about why you wrote this book and why you chose to write it this way.
So having spent, I suppose, 20 years, for the most part, writing for a scholarly audience, I think I woke up one morning and looked around and had the blinding insight that people are interested in Islam and Islamic history.
Thank you.
At the same time that I sensed some genuine curiosity, I think I discovered what anyone who reads in our field finds, and that is, for the most part, academics who write about Islamic history and Islam write inaccessibly, given to turgid prose and high theory, and journalists who write about the Middle East and Islam write accessibly, more transparently, more lucidly, but without the deep learning that the field really requires. So I said to myself I was going to write something that people would actually read, as opposed to the dozens of scholars who typically read a research monograph. So how does one do that? And I think, to some extent, I was informed by our own, and here's a short plug for a center in biography that we have at the Graduate Center, which does terrific work, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, which hosts every year for either distinguished or to be distinguished biographers. And so I had the sense that the biographical genre was one way in which one could deliver history in a way that's just more accessible. There was a second influence, which is a wonderful book. It started off as a radio broadcast, actually, A History of the World in 100 Objects. Some of you may know it, which used the object to tell the history of the world. And finally, and I begin the book with an example or two, within the Islamic literary tradition, there is a genre of biographical
No kidding.
and bibliobiographical writing, such that the idea of capsule biographies, and most of these are 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 words long. In other words, you can pick it up and in 10 minutes read about one or two people. There are books 40, 50, 60, 80 volumes long, filled with capsule biographies of notable Muslims. A good example dates from the 13th century, and it has 5,500 such biographies. You and I read them as graduate students, not all of them. And I said to myself, this is biography works as a genre. We can see it working as a genre in our own culture. It's got pretty long legs in this tradition. Why don't I try it out?
That's what I loved, is the degree to which there's a kind of mirroring of the very civilization that he's writing about in the way he's writing about it. How did you choose? I mean, how many people? 5,000? What did you say? Like, how do you pick?
So 30, there is nothing special about the number 30. Islamic Civilization in 30 Lives was really determined as much by the need to provide the background necessary to make sense of some of the subjects. I think many of you will know the names of some of those who feature in the book. Muhammad, Ali, son-in-law of the Prophet, and the forefather of Shiism. Saladin is in the book. Ibn Khaldun, perhaps a name familiar to some of you. Timur, or more infamously, Tamerlane, is in the book. There are 8 or 10 whom the educated reader will know of. Then another 20 or so whom the specialist will know of. And then 1 or 2 or 3 who will be new to virtually everyone. So how did I choose them? I was looking for exemplars. This is a book which is, and I think this is a point that we may return to, this is a book which is not a kind of greatest hits of Islam. It's not a book which apologizes on behalf of Islam. It's not a book that argues that the origins of civilization lie in Islam, or the Enlightenment, or democracy, or capitalism. Books have been written. It's a book that's meant to illustrate the diversity of the Islamic tradition, something which is, I think, woefully underappreciated. And then, and here I think there is an alignment between genre or form and the content that I'm trying to deliver, which is individuality. Everything from eccentrics to philosophers, scientists, men of power, men of the sword, as they say in the Arabic or Persian tradition, physicians, cranks, a proto-capitalist, a physician. So the underlying motivation was, if the average reader had a better appreciation for the diversity of the Islamic tradition and for the individuality of Muslims, then we could disengage from what I think is a pretty fruitless conversation about what is Islam. Is Islam compatible with X? Why doesn't Islam have a reformation? As I like to tell my students, questions that begin with Islam usually end very badly. So let's talk about what Muslims do rather than what Islam is.
I'd love for you guys just to get a flavor of what this book sounds like. Now, this is also totally unfair because you may have seen me leafing through the book as I'm sitting here, because I hadn't actually given this to Chase ahead of time. But there's one of the people whom I didn't know. I had never heard of her. It's a woman. She is a very, I want to say, internally contradictory to our eyes, perhaps, person, because she's both a slave and a very powerful and influential person. So let me just...
I'm meant to hold the microphone, hold the book.
Oh, right.
And I'll cope.
You'll cope?
What am I reading?
So I'm thinking down here, and then he has to turn the page. So, musicians, they have a page turner. So it's what were the rulers buying? And then just, to wherever you think is a good stopping place. And introduce it any way that you want on Adib.
So I find myself 2 or 3 pages into what is presumably a 6 or 7 page biography of a woman named Arib al-Ma'muniyya. Arib was born around 801, and the traditional death date, I think, is 897. She lived into her 90s. She was born probably to an upper middle class, or perhaps even a higher than upper middle class family, but for reasons that are lost to history, she was either stolen into slavery or sold into slavery. Some misfortune occurred when she was very young, and this is what occasionally happened when misfortune took place in the 9th or 10th century. Slavery would ensue. So she was purchased, but she was a girl of extraordinary talents. Her owner then invested a significant amount of money in her education. She was taught not only to read, but to compose music, to memorize thousands of lines of poetry so that she could be witty and entertaining in high company. And by the time she was a teenager, she had already been purchased by a caliph. That is to say, the king, the Pope/king of the polity, then Abbasid Empire in the 9th century.
Which is a big polity at that time.
Which is a
this
big
is a
polity.
big guy.
So she was purchased, sold, enters slavery, is trained, then begins to work for and become the courtier of a caliph, the first of 8 caliphs, and her job was to be entertaining, to play music, to be, as I said, witty and entertaining in gatherings, but also she was a sexual slave. So what were these rulers buying? Or perhaps more aptly, what was Arib selling, both literally and figuratively? Female slaves, especially those hired for entertainment, were badges of conspicuous consumption. And in this highly competitive court culture, which prized bravura performance, especially in music, poetry, and oral debate, Arib had conspicuous skills as a singer, composer, lute player, poet of popular verse, and prose stylist. The oral culture of the early Abbasid period was riven by controversy, contrasting modes of poetry and song being championed by rival traditionalists and innovators. Many, though certainly not all, many of the controversies were preserved in a monumental encyclopedia of songs and poems, the Book of Songs, written by Abul Faraj al-Isfahani, who died in 967. Several accounts portray Arib as a master of musical traditions and styles and an arbiter of taste. In the ferociously cultured and competitive setting that was Baghdad and Samarra, a city north of Baghdad, one in which leading poets fiercely debated the relative merits of the rose and the narcissus flowers, this mattered. It seems that Arib was an outspoken advocate of established forms, and to many ears, her compositions were canonical. In the male-dominated world of Iraq's elite culture, she also had the good fortune of beauty. I should say that towards the end of her life, she purchased her own freedom. She died a very, very wealthy woman, an extraordinarily powerful mentor for many, many younger women, and was, as I think I put it in the beginning, and perhaps I'm showing my age here, some combination of Amy Winehouse and Elizabeth Taylor.
I just find that such a fascinating insight into this culture. I mean, think about our conspicuous consumption. Think about the Rolexes, and not that they didn't have the equivalent of the Rolexes, but what this society was honoring by honoring, and the fact that she lived to be 90, whereas as a slave, I mean, if she had made a wrong move.
I think in the popular imagination, Islamic culture is by definition highly puritanical. Of course, the historical record shows that it varies from the highly puritanical to the extraordinarily louche, tolerant, indulgent.
But louche, tolerant, indulgent with a heavy dose of erudition. I mean, you know, of talent and educated talent. So what he did in graduate school, it's really terrible to look back at graduate school and say, God, how did we get progressively dumber. I don't think he did, but this guy he did historiography. So I didn't know what historiography meant when we were in graduate school. So I'm like, okay, Chase, you do your, but I think some of that comes out in this book, and there's a really fascinating theme that threads through it, which has to do with, number one, not having enough sources, and that's a lot of the reason why I bailed, is because what I wanted to do, there were no sources for it, so you can't do it. But where there are sources, what are the sources really talking about? Are they talking about their ostensible subject, or are they telling us something different?
So let me start with an example that I think can illustrate part of what you're getting at, Sarah. So I'll take another woman, and that is someone named Rabia. Rabia also belongs to the late 8th and early 9th century. She was an ascetic, what we call in the field a renunciant. She had a deep fear of God. She's almost the polar opposite of Arib.
Right.
She was driven by her fear of God to spend much of her day praying, to wearing intentionally very light clothes at night so she would be cold and constantly awoken by her chills. She was an exemplar of a certain mode of early Islamic piety. Virtually no one in the late 8th and 9th century recorded her life. We have probably 6 or 8 data that we can feel confident capture the reality of her lived experience, where she lived, what the name of her sister was, what the name of her mother was. There are, for instance, this massive confusion about did she come from a very wealthy family or a very poor family. If you read Islamic letters, you will find thousands of pages written about Rabia. Where does much of it come? Much of it comes from a 13th century collection of saints, what we would call a hagiography. What one finds in the 13th century is a Rabia who's not fearful of God, who doesn't wear modest clothing so she's kept awake all night by chills, not someone who eats very little, not someone who eschews social contact, especially sexual intercourse. What one finds is a miracle maker. So if she's walking around at night and she lacks a candle, she'll blow on her fingers and they will illumine, and she'll walk around. So what's happened in the 600 years, 400 years between her life and her canonization as what amounts to a Muslim saint is the infusion in her biography of all sorts of miracles that reflect not 8th or 9th century ideas of piety, but 11th, 12th, and 13th century ideas of what constitutes a saint. So the problem for the scholar is how do you shed the legends to get back to the genuine? That's a problem. Anyone who reads seriously about the 1st century of Islam, what do we know about Muhammad? What do we know about Ali? What we know for the most part is what people wrote 150, 200, 250 years later. So that's one problem. The obscure person who becomes famous. Then you have the problem of the obscure person who remains obscure. There are 2 or 3 of such characters who I've tried really hard to resurrect in the book. The example that springs to mind is someone named Ramisht, who belongs to the 12th century. He was a merchant millionaire. He was a ship owner and a trader. He lived in the Persian Gulf. He traded as far as China. He practiced other kinds of conspicuous consumption, huge houses. What we know of Ramisht survives because of a few inscriptions that he put up. He was not unlike a wealthy philanthropist nowadays, liked to see his name in the lights. So he gave to, he gave the money for a hospice for Sufis, and his gift, his endowment, was memorialized in the Kaaba. Then we have other examples of people who were really famous in their time and who more or less employed publicists. So Saladin had a whole bunch of publicists. They were poets who declaimed poetry. They were historians, scribes, scholars who recorded his exploits. He had inscriptions, again, commissioned on his behalf in order to project a certain vision of himself and his state and his victory. So there, the problem is too much bad information that we need to cut through. So the reason historiography is so interesting, that fancy and slightly awkward term for how people write history, is that it forces one to grapple with these fundamental questions of what is reliable, what is unreliable, why did people narrate these stories if they're not true? So I wrote a book about Islamic historiography, didn't solve any problems at all, but tried to get the field and ourselves grappling with that question, because I think it's fundamental to historical inquiry. And here I should say that part of the reason I wrote the book, it's not just about gross misunderstanding of Islam, it's also a plea, an illustration that this branch of the humanities history, it matters. And it matters for reasons that are substantive to how the Islamic world currently is, but it also matters because it's a way of educating. I know of no discipline, and I think the chair of my department will agree, which requires training in those critical forensic skills. How do we know what we know? In that sense, it may not be as rigorous, it's more imaginative than philosophy, but it's touching on fundamental problems of understanding and knowledge. In that sense, I very much wish people to respect history more than they currently do, if not just because it explains in part who we are, but also as a way of acquiring knowledge, and particularly in an environment in which there's so much information and so little understanding.
What I also love about that sort of, I don't want to say subtext, but that thread that weaves its way all the way through this book is that even, so part of the effort is forensic. What do we actually know about the actual person? But the ways in which those facts may be, quote, distorted or understood or emphasized in later periods also is an artifact of those later periods, which actually tells you something about those periods too. It's not just sort of this type of piety was honored in this period, whereas it wasn't in that period, but it you know, and so I wonder where you have people whose story is told and retold and doubtless changed through a period, or sorry, through the sequence of periods. Are you able to reflect, based on those changes, something meaningful about the different periods?
I think you can, for instance, in how the historical memory of Muhammad is transmitted, or the historical memory of Ali is transmitted. You can write histories of Shiism based on the oscillating representations, how Ali is accentuated, what parts of his life story are given prominence, what are not. Muhammad himself is a good case in point. The earliest layers of his biography, which we can infer and only very partially reconstruct, he's very much a man like you or I. A gifted man, a gifted orator, extraordinarily compelling speaker, courageous. The secondary or tertiary layers of the biography, he becomes a miracle worker. And he's assimilated to kind of late antique ideas of what constitutes prophecy. In other words, you can kind of see, and this is inferential, you can kind of see an Arabian mode of prophecy, which was indigenous and had its own terms, be eclipsed by how Christians, to a large extent, narrated the histories of their own saints and prophets. You can see that taking place, as Islam, as Muslims, assimilate the cultural norms of the world in which they lived. And as Sarah knows, in most parts of the Middle East, although the Islamic conquest took place in the 7th and early 8th century, it was the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th century before Muslims outnumbered non-Muslims. So you have to imagine highly heterogeneous societies in which Muslim scholars are rubbing shoulders with Christians and Jews, and they're learning from each other. And they're narrating their own histories to some extent in a competitive way, you know? So who is this person named Muhammad? Oh, well, he did this. Well, is he genuine? Or is he a fraud? You can imagine these questions being put, and Muslims saying, well, he's just like this person named Jesus. We have some miracles, you have some miracles. So it's that kind of context which forms, and I might say deforms, biography.
And touching on that particular point, this sort of cultural, almost osmosis that starts to happen. One of the guys, so I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and I was in a town called Kandahar, and a couple of hours up the road is a town called Ghazni. And so there's a guy in this book that I was particularly delighted to see, who is Mahmud of Ghazna. And one of the things that he did, I mean, again, as so many of these rulers who are known, and you'll have absorbed this from the Arib story, who are known often for their feats of arms, are equally known for their feats of intellectual, both patronage, but also capacity themselves, performance themselves. But Mahmud of Ghazna was a significant one. And I feel like there was there's an emblem of precisely one of these moments, really important moments of cultural osmosis that happens under his reign.
Mahmud of Ghazna belongs to the 11th century. He's one of these extraordinary individuals who I hope you would enjoy reading about, but I don't think you'd want to meet him. I think he's someone who prized talent above all. I think he had no patience for mediocrity. He's a wonderful, I think the way I put it is resolver of contradictions. So he himself was born a slave. He becomes ruler of the largest empire in the Middle East in the 11th century. Number two, he is an ethnic Turk, but he patronizes Persian language and literature. So that is the high prestige culture that he wished to surround himself with so as to broadcast his deep culture, his cosmopolitanism. In fact, it's with the patronage of Mahmud of Ghazna, as Sarah will know, that the single most important piece of early Persian literature is written. It's called the Shahnameh. It's often called the Persian national epic. It was written by a poet named Firdausi, who was employed by Mahmud and in his court. So a slave who becomes a ruler, an ethnic Turk who patronizes Persian letters and also Arabic letters, and also logic and poetry in a wide variety of genres and science. And at the same time, he's carrying out jihad virtually constantly in India, what we now call Pakistan. The processes underlying why what we now call Pakistan and North India become Muslim are set in train because this extraordinary patron of the arts, someone who values the finest specimens of high culture, is laying waste to parts of Indian culture, and his depredations of Somnath are infamous. So he is a paradox, as I put it, a paradox perhaps to us, but not in his time, not in his time.
The way you're describing it, you're saying that Persian high culture was something that he sort of aspired to and wanted to surround himself with. But I'd just like to pause there for a moment. And the timing is a little bit off. This is about middle of the 11th century, right? But Persian culture had been completely obliterated by, or almost completely obliterated by, the Arab conquests. And you had what is called Old Persian or various other languages. There was a new language that started to be spoken, but this particular epic, the Shahnameh, really represents, symbolically at least, even if it's a little bit, it's not the first, but it symbolically represents a renaissance, a cultural renaissance.
Sarah and I had the great pleasure of studying under a scholar who's now in his 90s, named Ahmed Mahdavi Domrani. Ahmed Mahdavi Domrani was a refugee from the Iranian Revolution. He left Iran, I think in 81 or 82, and moved to Philadelphia, and he would come once a week to Cambridge and teach. In my case, I don't know about yours, Sarah, he would teach Persian poetry and Arabic. He would teach the Arabic class in Persian and the Persian class in Arabic, with lots of French. His training had been in Iran in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. After much interrogation, I'll get to the point in a moment, after much interrogation, he conceded to knowing about 20,000 lines of Arabic and Persian poetry. If you asked him a question, what does this word mean? He wouldn't give you a dictionary definition. He would tilt his head back, close his eyes, and recite a line of poetry in which the word appeared. Ahmed Mahdavi Domrani taught me more than I can possibly count about Arabic and Persian letters. The Arabs conquered Iran, but Iran conquered Islam. That's what he told me several times in classes. And he drew my attention to a wonderful book called 2 Centuries of Silence, an entire literature about this period in which the extraordinary cultural legacy of ancient Iran, Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, any of you who've gone to Iran, you witness the deep and substantial history that goes back to the Achaemenids, through the Parthians and Sasanians, and then goes silent, obliterated, as you put it, by an initial wash of an Arabian culture, but then begins to bubble up, or one might say, the pump is primed and the wells are sunk, and then what happens is this extraordinary cultural movement that produces what we now know as Persian and what we now know as the extraordinary cultural efflorescence of this period and its subsequent periods.
And in a way, I think, although again, it's not the starting point, but somehow Ferdowsi and the Shahnameh is sort of emblematic of that, would you say?
For those of you who wish to get a sense of this culture that I'm describing, there are multiple translations of the Shahnameh. It's as I said, the Persian national epic, which begins in a mythological set of origins and carries through to the Sasanian period, ends right before the Islamic conquests, and to this day, I think it's about 20 or 30,000 couplets of poetry, I can't quite recall, is really the closest that the Iranian tradition has to a canonical text in which identity and the past is anchored.
Just pursuing this theme a little bit, there's a tendency in the West to kind of say, sure, Islamic culture and letters and intellectual science, mathematics, astronomy, yeah, sure, it was important in the Middle Ages, but then it all came screeching to a halt. Is that accurate?
I think that's what's called a leading question. But it's an important question because there are a few passages in this book which they verge on the polemical. Yeah. So H.A.R. Gibb, the Orientalist whom I mentioned earlier, who devoted 50 years of his life to studying Arabic, he and many, many other Orientalists really subscribed to this decline theory of Islam in which, as Sarah was alluding, sure, in the 8th and 9th century, the patrimony of classical culture, both from Greece as well as from India, enter the Islamic world. Translations are made from Sanskrit, from Greek. They enter into Arabic. And many of these disciplines then begin to exercise really important influence, not only upon the development of an indigenous form of philosophy, but also other forms of rationalism, theology, the exact science, mathematics, astronomy. So no one disputes that in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century, if you have any serious interest in learning, you don't spend your time in what we would now call Western Europe, which was a cultural wasteland for all intents and purposes. You go to the Eastern Mediterranean, you study in the courts such as Mahmud of Ghazna. It is a remarkable thing about our field that this decline theory in which there is this extraordinary period of scientific and intellectual growth, the model held that it came to a screeching halt in the 12th century and has been either static, society has been either static or in decline. We now know that that's not the case. You can find in the Arabic tradition, in the Persian tradition, in the Ottoman tradition, in Turkish, the continual experimentation with rationalism, the continued study of philosophy. You can find, for instance, the history of the astrolabe is unthinkable independent of the history of the astrolabe in the Middle East, not just in the 11th and 12th, but in subsequent centuries. What we seem to have is a trope, this idea that I think says more about our idea in the West of how we came to be than how Islam or Islamic culture actually is. I think the idea somehow is, well, starting in the 13th and 14th century, the Western tradition, institutions in the West, began to organize themselves intellectually. The rise of science, ultimately, the torch was passed from Athens to Baghdad, and then Baghdad to Europe. And so this model of stultification and stasis cannot be squared with the facts and had a certain, I think, cultural appeal. Having said that, the remarkable thing to historians of science is why the West accelerated the way it did, not why Islam lost its competitive advantage. It's the exceptionalism of Western Europe rather than the rule of the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia.
I am eventually going to relinquish this thing to you guys, so there are a couple of those right there. But before I do that, I just can't resist one last kind of big picture question, which really goes to that sense of exceptionalism. I mean, here we are sitting in New York City in the United States a week before we all have to vote, and God knows we think we're exceptional, right? We think this period is exceptional in its sort of internationalism, in its cosmopolitanism, in its globalism, if you will. You've already been we've all been hearing nuggets of why that's clearly not true, but I wonder if you could just talk to sum up a little bit about the contrast between, on the one hand, what might be seen as a chaotic and not very, I want to say, fertile political history. Often, a lot of these people end up dead in unpleasant ways, and yet concurrent with that seems to be a kind of ecumeny, if that's the word, something close to that that to me looks a lot like globalism. I mean, a set of tools, if you will, or a set of cultural, a kind of cultural language that allows for a tremendous amount of activity in spite of what we would see as political obstacles.
I think that's right. Let me say an answer by giving just reflecting briefly upon two moments of this history. The first would be the 7th and 8th century, in which the Islamic conquests take place. What's the political consequence of the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th century? It's the creation of a polity that begins in Andalusia, southern Spain, and which travels across North Africa, all the way through what we now call the Middle East, all the way into current-day Afghanistan, and even points further west. Politically integrated, in many moments of its history, using the same coinage or comparable coinage so that exchange was possible. Culturally unified by the use of Arabic. Conceptually unified by a shared acknowledgement that the caliph sitting in Baghdad or in Damascus ruled, and a shared cultic tradition such that not only were traders moving across the Mediterranean, indeed into the Persian Gulf and as far as the Far East, but pilgrims were moving from those areas to visit places like Damascus and Jerusalem. So a moment of extraordinary exchange.
And a legal framework also. I mean, contracts, right? Trade depends on contracts. So you had to have some sort of shared understanding of how agreements and things like that are.
That's exactly right. And there's a similar, even more deeply integrating moment after we've all grew up, I trust most of us grew up on a certain idea of the Mongol conquests, Hulagu and Genghis Khan, and ultimately Timur and Towers of Skulls, a certain idea of cultural destruction. A lot of cultural destruction took place. But in many respects, the state that followed those extraordinary Mongol conquests, there you have a polity that begins in the Korean peninsula and extends to Hungary, had that same integrating power. So, language, culture, law, currency. Under those highly favorable conditions, you had extraordinary moments of cultural production and a deep cosmopolitanism. I think there must be a half dozen figures in the book who not only have Arabic, but they'll have Persian. Take, for instance, one of my favorites, Biruni, who is a contemporary. Biruni is arguably one of the world's greatest scientists, really comparable to Kepler or Copernicus, an extraordinary figure, mathematics, astronomy. Well, he would have spoken Iranian at home. He learned Arabic. He would have also been able to read Persian. He also had Sanskrit. He had Hebrew. He was an empiricist who was as interested in eclipses and the summer equinox and calculating latitudes as he was in recording very, very carefully his observations of how Muslims pray, how Jews pray, how Christians pray, how Hindus pray. So an extraordinary mind who can really only make sense of him in that context, which is highly cosmopolitan, very sophisticated, in which knowledge was so competitively secured that you had to be brilliant in order to prosper.
So our globalized age, has a lot of forerunners, I think. We do have 2 microphones here, so anyone with questions, please. And it would be delightful for us if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before you ask your question.
Could you address the...
Sorry, who are you? Sorry?
I'm sorry?
Just interested in who you are.
Okay.
That would be great.
Okay, my name is Hank Hanau. Wondering how the Sunni Shiite divergence affects any of this?
It's a very good question. The origins of the Sunni-Shiite divide lie in the 7th century. The crystallization of distinctive legal intellectual traditions dates from the 9th and the 10th century. It's not until the 16th century that we begin to see a Sunni Shiite geography that is familiar to us. What do I mean by that? We take it for granted somehow that Shiism is more or less synonymous with Iran. That's not true in the 7th century, or the 8th, or the 9th, or the 10th, or the 11th, or the 12th, or the 13th, or the 14th. It only begins to be true in the 15th and the 16th, really the 16th century, when Twelver Shiism is established as the state religion in Iran. So, in the early periods, the crystallization of these separate identities and separate religious systems takes some time. There's a great deal of coexistence and sporadic conflict. If we could beam ourselves back in time and go to Baghdad in the 9th century, we might find the occasional riot between Sunnis and Shiites. But it would be the occasional riot, and it would reflect a particular political moment in Baghdad. So one should not imagine a kind of serene ecumenicism at work, but one should model a kind of default coexistence and respect agreements about pretty much all of the important religious matters. For instance, if you compare and contrast Sunni legal schools with most Shiite legal schools, you don't find many substantive differences. A very strong disagreement about what happened in the 7th century and who succeeded Muhammad and who should have succeeded Muhammad. The Shiite view being that Ali should have succeeded Muhammad, the non-Shiite view saying, well, succession took place as it took place. Tough luck.
Just to follow on to that, apart from some of the leaders who, particularly in that later period, were part of making Iran, or what we call today Iran Shiite, I mean, in terms of the scholars and intellectual figures that you feature here, what's the mix, Sunni to Shia?
I might have answered your earlier question about how I made the selections by saying I was looking for distribution Sunni, Shiite, Arab, Persian, Turk, scientist, man of the sword, discoverer, traveler, physician. Most of the figures that I cover are Sunnis. About 85% of the world's population are Sunni. The world now has 1.6 billion Muslims thereabout. About 85% are Sunni. But I've got 2 or 3 Shiites, one of whom al-Hilli, who is a very important figure in that post-Mongol period. And it's thanks to al-Hilli, for instance, I mentioned a moment ago that our understanding that Iran is Shiite, well, that's actually kind of only yesterday within the grand scheme of Islamic history. The Shiite communities of southern and central Iraq, which have now been, shall we say, activated politically, those are much older. Those go back to the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. And al-Hilli, one of the personages whom I discuss, he was a crucial person in institutionalizing the Shiism of southern Iraq. So when we look at Iraq now, the south is mostly Shiite, central Iraq is a combination of Sunni and Shiite, and the north is Sunni. That is a product of history. And obviously it's a history that is consequential for what's going on now.
Ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Malvina Nathanson. To what extent is Islamic culture, or the culture as it developed, influenced by pre-Muhammad traditions in the area?
In all sorts of ways that are very difficult to track. I'll give you a single example. the earliest and most important biographer of Muhammad himself is someone named Muhammad ibn Ishaq, who died in about 765, 767. Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he came from a background that was deeply Christian and Jewish. Many biographers of the Prophet were imbued with Christian ideas, Jewish ideas, Hebrew Bible, so influenced that, for instance, many of what we take to be the events of Muhammad's life, in some respects, appear to be narrations of biblical history imposed upon Arabian history. Single example, Muhammad in 622, some of you will be familiar with this history, is said to have left Mecca for Medina on what's called the Hijra, the emigration. Many scholars have argued that's a calque, that's really just a recycling of an Exodus narrative. So what can appear to be Islamic is genuinely Islamic, but at the same time it reflects a prehistory of certain patterns, certain paradigms of what prophets do and how history takes place. Needless to say, Islamists wouldn't agree with my reading of the Islamic tradition, but there you have it.
Let me just put in a plug for the polytheists, right? So it's not just the monotheistic traditions, nor even Zoroastrianism, which was also a pretty organized, in our perspective, religion, but you had the whole poetic tradition of polytheists. You have,
Absolutely.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm Ken Siegel. Sarah, your excellent book, Thieves of State, really opened my eyes to the state of corruption in Afghanistan and how that may be driven by U.S. Neoliberal policies and restructuring and all that. Here's my question. The corruption, what about the corruption in the period, Chase, that you have studied? Was there a lot of corruption and what drove it? And tell us about the corruption at that time.
I think I'll probably cede the microphone to the expert in corruption. But I'll make one fairly obvious observation, at the risk of sounding like an apologist for corruption.
Oh, God. Am I going to have to kill him?
So those two, I gave you two examples of these extraordinary polities that stretched from the Atlantic to the Hindu Kush, or from the Korean Peninsula to Hungary. They ran on informal networks of patronage and connection. They ran in a way in which the lines between public and private were, shall we say, blurry. So what we call corruption, and reasonably criticize and see as corrosive to democratic culture, something about which Sarah has written very eloquently, these are not societies which are democratic. These are not societies that ascribe cultural value to transparency. These are societies that have to overcome enormous challenges of technology and communication and heterogeneity and ethnic difference. And so, shall we say, the transaction, the transactions that we would see as signs of corruption are built into how the state works.
So rewind and erase what he just said. That was a beautiful pitch, low and straight across, right across. So one of the guys that Chase chose not to put in this book, and that I did have a little question mark, is a guy called Nizam al-Mulk. And he was a phenomenal statesman. And he wrote a book called basically The Book of Politics, Siyasatnameh. And part of what inspired me for my book was finding this book again, which we had read in school, and reading it with my corruption-focused eyes and finding the book is all about corruption, and it is all about how if you do too much of that, you will, it's a book of advice to his sultan, to his king, and he's example after example and aphorism after aphorism about how the way you're going to lose your kingdom is if you don't enforce your subordinates' activities on behalf of the people. And that, in fact, you will be judged for the behavior of your subordinates. And it's really interesting because I have a chapter that starts, well, it doesn't start, but it includes Nizam al-Mulk. It starts with the guy who wrote one of these that we're the most familiar with, which is The Prince. Machiavelli's The Prince is one of this type of literature. And if you read it carefully, what you see is that he's all for all of the vices except corruption. Leave the property and the women of your subjects alone, or you will lose your principate. And so I would argue that, in fact, even in non-democratic societies, both of these societies were extremely non-democratic, but these two statesmen really recognized the corrosive power of corruption as a danger to the kingdom.
Yeah, my name is Larry Petricaro. The question I have, you describe a society, a civilization that's rather cosmopolitan and extensive, at least at certain points in its time. You know, I have a tendency to think, at least in today's terms, of Islam as being rather intolerant of other religions. How, is that something that was traditional? Is that something that had changed at a period of time? Or when this was a very cosmopolitan society, was it a very open society to other kinds of beliefs?
A crucial question, and I'll give you an answer that you might find unsatisfying, but I think it's the honest one, which is enormous variation from one place to the next and from one time to the next. So at the structural level, in terms of the rights that non-Muslims possessed, it can be argued that there was an implicit, even explicit, constitution at work which protected minority rights, such that the extraordinary, systematic, brutal bouts, incidents of persecution that are in the Western historical tradition are unknown in Islamic history up until the 18th or 19th century. In other words, that legal framework of acknowledged rights mattered. On the other hand, there were moments of persecution, there were moments of martyrdom. One of the ways in which the 19th and the 20th and the 21st century, even more so, differs from the early modern and pre-modern period is the emergence and the systemization of intolerance and the brutalization of confessional as well as Muslim, non-Muslim relations. How does that take place? Let me commend to your attention a book recently written by one of Helena, you're my colleagues, Beth Barron, about, and this is just a single example, and I'm not saying this provides a global explanation, but it's a book that argues that the experience of missionaries in Egypt was crucial for how the Muslim Brethren, the Muslim Brotherhood, one of the leading Islamic revolutionary, or shall we say, critical groups emerged. Their ideas of non-Muslims were deeply informed by their experience with missionaries. Not for a moment am I suggesting that it's the missionaries' fault for making Muslims intolerant, but there's an ideological temperature that spikes in the 19th and 20th century, and colonialism is part of the story, such that that millennium-long, indeed longer, millennium-long tradition, which again, I'm not saying was some kind of ecumenical Disneyland of you're okay, I'm okay, but had embedded within it certain expectations of rights and respect, that's been disrupted, and as we now see in parts of the Middle East, well, to use your term, totally obliterated. It's one of the modern period and the emergence of nationalism haven't been merely disruptive, but they've been destructive to some of these traditions.
There are two gentlemen here. I think we've got time for these last two questions. Just be aware, this isn't just entertainment. This is for sale. And Chase will be signing copies and will be able to respond to any other questions or thoughts that people have at that time.
And all royalties go to the foundation of the Graduate Center.
Bravo. Henry Saltzman's my name. Most of us know that Maimonides in the Jewish tradition interfaced with Islam, Arabic writing and speaking and so on. Could you say a bit about the Jewish-Islamic interface during the Middle Ages?
You really should be asking my wife that question. She's standing in the second row. She could give you a much better answer than I. So it's multidimensional. So on the one hand, the Jews, like Christians, like Zoroastrians, as well as polytheists, provide the cultural background, the matrix in which early Islam crystallizes. Any historian of Islamic law cannot help but acknowledge the debts it owes to Jewish law. So that's point number one. Point number two is that Jews, starting in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, were living in a world that was not only Islamic in terms of its governance, power was possessed by Muslims, but in which Arabic had become the lingua franca, and Islamic institutions and Islamic ideas were the ascendant ones. And so there you see the influence reversing. And then Jews begin to become influenced by Arabic Islamic culture. They pick up and use Arabic not just in the language of commerce, but also, as you suggested, in the academic context. Similarly, there are points of rabbinic law, which, and the way that, for instance, Jews narrate history, which are unmistakably signs of influence from the Islamic side of things. So it's a highly, it's a context in which influence is mutual and in which influence reflects relative status. Of course, in the case of Maimonides, there you have a particular Spanish tradition in which the exchange between Muslims and non-Muslims and the role of Jews in the Islamic intellectual tradition and vice versa is particularly striking and exceptional in some respects.
Sir.
Thank you for this discussion and your work. Bob Larrick, I work with UN NGOs. Actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of people that literally founded the UN. I've been proposing a good government holistic interfaith institute to be able to deal with these issues more constructively. I think your talk, I wanted to ask, your talk brought up, to me at least, the idea of civilizations have not always been separation of church and state. The issues of respect for others versus abuse of power, corruption. There's polarization all over the world today. Obviously in this country, Trump, who's a good Republican. I work with the UN with the mental health community and represented general semantics, which promotes an orientation of win-win cultures and communication, communicating more accurately to each other, different groups, different generations for a better world. And what do you think the idea of New York's Graduate Center and your work being a center for greater inclusion and culture in the long history of New York City. And
That's what we do already. That's what we do already.
don't we need it? Even East Coast, the coast and the middle of the country seems to be so polarized. And even
Well,
for
we
Americans-
we do what we can do here, and I think
Thank you, sir.
I should say that it's an extraordinary privilege to be at the City University of New York. It's an extraordinary privilege of mine to work with colleagues who are so committed to the mission of the university, which is one of diversity and empowering talent wherever that talent may be. And we see that as our job here at the Graduate Center to advance the mission of the university as a whole, which, as some of you may know, this university has 285,000 students. So it is an extraordinary venture project, I think, in opportunity, equity, respect, tolerance. And as I said, it's a privilege to be here.
What a great note to end on.